3 weeks ago, I destroyed a woman's $82,000 Mercedes, and the entire neighborhood came outside and pulled up folding chairs to watch. I didn't make a phone call. I didn't throw a single punch. I spent one Saturday digging holes in my own front lawn, and then I waited. That's the whole story, except it isn't. Because the part nobody tells you is how 6 weeks before any of that happened, I was standing at my kitchen window at 2 a.m, watching this woman haul cinder blocks across my yard in her pajamas, and I genuinely did not know if there was anything I could do to stop her. Her name was Karen. I'm going to call her Karen, because that is what every single person on Elmwood Drive started calling her about 3 weeks into this whole thing. And I think by the time I'm done telling you what she did, you'll understand why it fits perfectly. I moved into the house on Elmwood Drive 4 years ago. Small corner lot, quiet residential street. The kind of street where the guy 2 doors down still rakes his leaves by hand and waves at every car that passes. I put real money into that lawn. I'm not going to pretend I'm not that guy, because I am absolutely that guy. 4 years of watering schedules, soil amendments twice a year, a very specific grass seed blend I ordered online that I will not apologize for, and an edging routine that I did every single Saturday morning without fail. That corner lot was my thing. It was the first thing people noticed when they came to visit, and I liked that. I worked for it. 4 years of work sitting right there in the front of my house every single day. Karen moved in across the street about 8 months before any of this started. Big white Mercedes SUV. I waved the first time she pulled in and she looked straight through me like I wasn't there. I chalked it up to moving stress. I waved a second time a few days later. Same thing. I stopped waving after that. People settle in at different speeds. I didn't think much of it. The first time she drove across my lawn, I genuinely thought it was an accident. She came around the corner a little wide. Her front tires cut across the corner of my grass, and she straightened out into her driveway. I was in the kitchen, and I saw it happen through the window, and my first thought was she misjudged the turn. Corner lots have that problem sometimes. Drivers come in too hot and clip the edge. I went outside, looked at the 2 fresh tire tracks cut through the corner I'd spent 4 years building, and I smoothed it over with a hand rake. Gave her every possible benefit of the doubt. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell me what you would do, and hit subscribe if you like good unfiltered revenge stories. She did it again the next morning, and this time I was standing on my porch with a cup of coffee when it happened. So I can tell you with complete certainty that she did not misjudge anything. She was driving straight down the street and she turned, deliberately, not drifting wide, not misjudging a curve. She turned her wheel and she drove across my lawn at 15 miles an hour and then straightened back into her driveway. I was standing 12 feet away. She did not look at me once, did not slow down, did not hesitate, just drove across my lawn like I was furniture. I put my coffee down. I walked across the street. I knocked on her door. She answered it with a smile. And I want to be specific about that smile because I still think about it. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't a confused smile. It was the smile of someone who had already run this entire conversation in her head and already knew how it was going to end. She had been waiting for me to knock on that door. I could feel it in the 2 seconds before she said a single word. I kept it completely calm. I told her I wasn't sure if she'd noticed, but she'd been cutting across my corner when she pulled in. I'd worked pretty hard on that lawn, and if she could just straighten out a little earlier, I'd really appreciate it. That was it. 30 seconds. No attitude, no accusations, just a reasonable ask from one neighbor to another. She looked at me for a moment, like she was deciding something. Then she said very clearly, "I can drive wherever I want on this street." And she closed the door. I stood on her porch for a second, just processing what had just happened. Then I walked back to my house, and I sat down and I told myself, give her one more day. Maybe she's going through something. Maybe that came out wrong. I was still in the charitable neighbor phase, and I gave her every excuse I could manufacture. Went to bed telling myself tomorrow would be different. She drove across my lawn 3 times the next day. 3. And they weren't the same gentle arc anymore. The second pass, she came in so wide she was halfway across my yard before she turned. The third time, she held her horn down the entire length of the crossing. Long, flat, sustained. Just leaning her palm on that horn while she drove through my grass at full speed, making absolutely certain I could hear it from inside my house, making absolutely certain I understood she knew I was in there. and she was doing it anyway, and the horn was just to make sure I didn't miss it. That horn. I will not forget that sound for the rest of my life, because that horn was the moment I understood this was not about shortcuts or habits or anything that had a rational explanation. This woman had looked at my lawn and made a decision. The decision was that my lawn was going to be her personal demonstration, and the demonstration was this: I do exactly what I want on this street, and you cannot stop me. I want to be honest about what I felt in those first few days, because I think it matters to the story. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was something more unsettling than anger. It was the feeling of realizing that someone has looked directly at you and decided you don't matter, that your 4 years of work and your corner lot and your very specific grass seed blend are completely irrelevant to them, that you are just a prop in a story they are telling themselves about how powerful they are. That feeling sat in my chest for days, and I didn't have a name for it, and I still kind of don't. My first move was the most normal, obvious, completely ineffective thing I could have done. I bought 4 cinder blocks, big heavy ones, drove them home in my truck, lugged them out one at a time, and placed them in a solid line at the corner of my lawn, right in the exact path she always took. I stepped back and looked at them. Problem solved. She literally cannot drive through concrete blocks. I felt good about this. I'm not embarrassed to admit that I actually felt good about it. I went inside. She didn't come home until late that afternoon, and I watched from the window as she came down the street and turned into her driveway the normal way, all the way around the cinder blocks, no contact. I made dinner. I went to bed satisfied. At 2 a.m, my phone buzzed. I lay there for a second, ignoring it. Then it buzzed again. Then I heard something outside, and I looked through the front window, and she was out there, in the dark, in her pajamas. And she was moving my cinder blocks, not throwing them, not kicking them, carrying them, one at a time, walking deliberately across the street and stacking them very neatly on my front porch. She was calm about it, methodical. She made 4 trips in the dark at 2 a.m, and she stacked those blocks on my porch like she was returning something she'd borrowed. Then she walked back to her car, got in, and I thought for 1 second that she was just going to drive home. Then she floored it. 3 burnouts. Right on my lawn, just laying on the gas and spinning those back tires until the corner was 2 long black strips of destroyed grass and scorched dirt. Then she pulled calmly back into her garage and the neighborhood went quiet. I stood at my front window in the dark for a long time, not saying anything to anyone, including myself. I looked at those 2 black strips. I looked at the 4 cinder blocks stacked neatly on my porch, and I thought, this person came outside at 2 a.m. in her pajamas specifically to make a point. Whatever I thought this situation was 3 days ago, it is something much larger and much more deliberate than that. Here's where I made the biggest mistake of the first half of this whole thing. I called the police. I had it all on camera, every single pass, the horn, the 2 a.m. block relocation, the burnouts. I had a timestamp stamped video file of everything she had done to my lawn over the past week and a half. I called the non-emergency line. An officer came out the next morning. I showed him the footage on my laptop at my kitchen table. He watched the whole thing. He didn't say a lot. When it finished, he leaned back in his chair and he let out a long, slow breath. Not the frustrated sigh of a guy who's going to do something about this. The tired sigh of a guy who has seen this exact situation more times than he can count and already knows exactly how limited his options are. He said, I can write her a $25 ticket for the property damage. He paused after he said it. Just let that number sit in the air between us for a full 3 seconds. $25 for the deliberate 2 a.m. destruction of my lawn, for 6 separate incidents of documented property damage, for the cinder blocks on my porch, for the horn, for all of it. $25. Then he looked at me and said, is that really what you want me to do? I told him no. He nodded like that was the answer he expected. He told me if anything escalated to physical contact with me or serious structural damage to my property, I could call again and he'd come back out. Then he left. I stood in my doorway and watched his cruiser roll down the street. And I thought, okay, that option is closed. That door is completely shut. Whatever happens next, I am entirely on my own. I went back to the hardware store the next day with the intention of being reasonable one more time. I bought wood, paint, and stakes, and I spent a Sunday afternoon building a proper sign. I'm a decent hand with wood, and it came out well. Clean white background, black letters, no driving on the grass, clear, unambiguous, professional looking. I drove it into the corner of my lawn at a good angle where you couldn't miss it coming around that bend. I stood back and looked at it. It looked like the kind of sign a person who had tried everything else reasonable would put in their yard, which is exactly what it was. She ran it over the next morning, didn't swerve, didn't slow down, hit it straight on its speed, dragged it about 20 feet before it popped loose, and left it in 2 pieces in the middle of my lawn. I found it when I got back from work. She hadn't moved it, just left both pieces right there where they landed, so I could see exactly what had happened the moment I pulled into my driveway. I stood there in my work clothes at 6 in the evening, looking at the splintered remains of my sign. And I thought, she is not going to stop. She is never going to stop on her own. That is not what this is. I went to the hardware store a third time, and this time I bought 80 pounds of river rocks, the big, smooth landscaping ones. I spent an entire Tuesday evening setting them in a careful, tight line along the corner of my lawn. I took my time with it, made it look like intentional landscaping, which it basically was. When I finished, it actually looked good, better than the cinder blocks, more natural. I was genuinely pleased with how it turned out. I went inside thinking, 80 pounds of river rock is a different problem than 4 cinder blocks. She came home the next afternoon, got out of her car, walked to the corner of my lawn, and she threw every single rock onto my front porch. Every single one. Not a few, not the ones blocking her direct path, every rock I'd placed. She went back and forth between my lawn and my porch like she was doing yard work, and she moved every single rock by hand. It took her about 15 minutes. I watched from just inside my front window the entire time. She wasn't angry about it. She wasn't rushing. She just moved them all with the steady, unhurried calm of someone completing a task they had fully committed to before they started. When she was done, she stood back and gasped like a donkey. Then she walked back, got in the car, and did another burnout. I did not go outside. I watched the tire smoke rise from what used to be my corner, and I just stood there. But wait, it gets worse. That night, she posted a video to the neighborhood Facebook group. She had filmed herself doing a full 360 spin out on my lawn, full video, posted it to the community page where 243 of my neighbors could see it. She captioned it, "Keeping the neighborhood interesting." 17 people liked it. 17. I sat on my couch with my phone in my hand and I scrolled through those little thumbs up icons and I looked at the names. Some of them I knew. The guy 4 houses down who I'd helped carry an air conditioner unit up a flight of stairs 2 summers ago. The woman on the corner who I'd always exchanged waves with. 17 people on my street who looked at a video of someone destroying 4 years of work on my property and decided it deserved a like. Like it was content. Like my lawn was an entertainment venue and she was the show. Something changed in me in that moment. I want to be careful about how I describe it because I don't want to over-dramatize it. It wasn't a rage thing. It wasn't dramatic. It was more like a quiet click, like a lock turning over somewhere behind my eyes. I put my phone down and I sat in the dark for a little while, and I stopped thinking about how to stop her from driving on my lawn, and I started thinking about something entirely different. She commented on her own post the next morning. "Some little boys think they can stop me." That was the comment. And then underneath it, she added that she was going to do a big victory burnout that Friday night to celebrate her birthday. Her birthday. She announced it publicly on the neighborhood Facebook group. A birthday burnout. On my lawn. With an audience. She was turning this into an event. I read that comment 3 times. I thought about the cinder blocks on my porch. I thought about the broken sign. I thought about the $25 ticket that even the cop couldn't bring himself to actually recommend. I thought about 80 pounds of river rocks that one woman had moved by hand in 15 minutes, with the patience of someone who was not even slightly worried about consequences. And then I thought about the one thing that none of my previous moves had accounted for. She had been driving the exact same path, at the exact same speed, across the exact same corner of my lawn, every single day for 6 weeks. I knew the arc down to the foot. I knew where she entered, where she turned, where she put pressure on that steering wheel. I knew the angle and the speed and the tire width and the weight of that SUV. She had been handing me a blueprint every single day, and I had been too busy reacting to look at it. I did not sleep well that night, but it wasn't the angry kind of not sleeping. It was the calculating kind. I lay there in the dark and I thought about soil density. I thought about steel. I thought about depth and load distribution and what happens to a vehicle's underside when it passes over something solid at 15 miles an hour, and that something is buried at exactly the right depth and cut at exactly the right height and spaced at exactly the right interval. I ran those numbers in my head for 3 hours. I wasn't finished when I fell asleep, and I picked them back up the second I woke up. Nobody told me this part of it. Nobody told me that the planning stage would feel like this, like something cold and exact settling into place, like finally being on the right side of a problem after weeks of being on the wrong side of it. The next morning, I got in my truck and I drove to the farm supply store out on Route 9. Not the hardware store I'd been going to, the farm supply store. The kind of place that sells fencing materials and livestock equipment and things that are built to hold against serious force. I walked in and I found what I was looking for, and I put 12 of them in my cart. And the old guy behind the counter looked at my cart and looked at me. His name was Earl. I know that because it was on his name tag, and because by the end of that conversation, I felt like I owed him something, and knowing a man's name felt like the least I could do. He was maybe 65, the kind of 65 built by actual physical work rather than a gym membership, and he had the demeanor of someone who had heard a lot of unusual requests over a long career and stopped being surprised by most of them. He looked at my cart. He looked at me. He asked what I needed 12 steel posts for. I told him the short version. Corner lot, 6 weeks. Mercedes, horn, 2 a.m, the video with 17 likes, the birthday burnout announcement. I kept it factual. I didn't editorialize. I just told him what had happened in the order it happened and watched his face while I did it. His expression didn't change much. A small tightening around the eyes at the cinder blocks on the porch, a barely perceptible nod at the river rocks. When I got to the 17 likes, he exhaled slowly through his nose. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the posts in my cart, picked one up, felt the gauge of the steel, set it back down, then looked at me and said something I have thought about every single day since. Cut them flush. Aim for the oil pan. That was it. 6 words. I stood there for a second, making sure I'd heard him right. He was already walking toward the register. I grabbed my cart and followed him. He rang me up without saying anything else about it, and when the total came up, he looked at it for a second, punched in a code, and gave me 20% off without me asking. He put the receipt in the bag and looked at me one more time. Space them right, he said. Don't rush the spacing. I drove home with 20 posts in the truck bed, turning that advice over in my head the entire way. Cut them flush. Flush means ground level. Flush means invisible. Flush means she drives over them 4 times a day for a week and never sees a single thing wrong and never changes a single behavior. Flush means she has no idea. And aim for the oil pan means you understand the geometry of a vehicle at speed. You understand where the underside sits relative to the wheels, and you place each post at the exact location where it will do the most damage. Earl had thought about this before. That was clear. Earl had thought about this problem in detail and had arrived at a very specific answer and gave it to me in 6 words and a 20% discount. I got home. She was washing her car in the driveway. She looked up. She smiled. I smiled back. I kept driving. I parked in my garage, sat in the truck for a moment, and looked at the posts in the bed. I thought about spacing. I thought about the arc she drove. 6 weeks of watching it from my kitchen window had burned that arc into my memory like a bright light burns into your eyes. I knew exactly where her front tires entered my lawn, exactly where they tracked across, exactly where the rear tires followed, and the weight distribution of a large SUV at 15 miles an hour on a corner turn. I got out a piece of paper, drew it to scale, and sat at my kitchen table, planning the spacing the way Earl told me to. Not rushed, deliberate. 2 hours later, 7 positions were marked, and I knew exactly where every post would go. I set my alarm for 6 the next morning. I got up before 7, made coffee, put on work clothes, grabbed my post hole digger, heavy mallet, measuring tape, and diagram, and went out front to start digging. It's a specific kind of work, digging post holes by hand. Not complicated, not fast. You set the digger, drive it, pull up the dirt, repeat. 3 feet deep for each hole. I'd marked every position with a small flag the night before, walking the ark in the dark at 11 p.m. when nobody was outside, pressing the little orange flags into the soil at each point. Now I pulled the first flag and started digging. Within about 15 minutes, I had established a rhythm, and the rhythm felt good. First neighbor came by about 40 minutes in. He lived 2 houses down. Gary, the guy I mentioned who rakes his own leaves. He stopped on the sidewalk, watched me for a second. We made eye contact, and he said, "That what I think it is?" I told him yes. He nodded slowly. "About time," and kept walking. That was the whole conversation. Second neighbor came by about an hour later. She stopped, watched for a moment, didn't say anything, went back inside, and came back out with 2 cold beers. She set them on my porch railing without a word and went back home. I looked at the beers for a second and kept digging, all of it before Karen woke up. Third one brought me a beer too. Fourth one brought a shovel, not just any shovel, a good one, a full-size, sharp-edged digging spade that was clearly better than mine. "Borrow this, it'll go faster," he said, handed it over, and went back inside. It did go faster, significantly faster. I switched to it immediately and made a note to return it with a bottle of something good. Here's what nobody did that Saturday. Nobody walked across the street and knocked on Karen's door. Nobody told her what was happening. 6, 7, 8 people walked past over the course of that morning and afternoon. Some stopped and watched. Some brought things. Not one of them said a word to her. That neighborhood had watched 6 weeks of this. That neighborhood had absorbed the 2 a.m. horn and the burnouts and the Facebook post and the 17 likes from people who should have known better and the river rocks on my porch and the broken sign and every single thing she had done. And on the Saturday that I dug 7 holes 3 feet deep in my front lawn, every single one of my neighbors who walked past understood exactly what was happening, and not one of them said a word about it to the woman across the street. That told me something about how the street felt about Karen that 6 weeks of living through it hadn't fully communicated yet. I finished the last hole. My back was sore. And my hands had that deep, raw feeling that comes from a full day of real work. I was dirty in a way that felt earned. I stood up. I looked at the 7 holes. Then I got the posts from the garage, and I started setting them. This part took longer than the digging because Earl had said don't rush the spacing, and I was not rushing the spacing. Each post went in by hand first, positioned exactly at the angle on my diagram, and then I drove it down with the mallet until it hit 3 feet. I measured the depth every time, not estimated, measured. When each post was at exactly the right depth, I got the hacksaw and I cut it at ground level, flush, completely flush. I ran my hand over the cut end of each one when I was done. You couldn't feel it unless you were looking for it, and even then your fingers just felt dirt and grass root, and the faint hardness of steel that you dismiss as a buried rock if you didn't already know what it was. I packed the dirt back in around each post tightly. I tamped it down. I spread the displaced topsoil carefully over the area so the surface was even. Then I spread grass seed over the entire corner, not just over the holes, over the whole corner, which had been getting chewed up for 6 weeks and genuinely needed it. When I was done, I stepped back onto the sidewalk and I looked at that corner from every angle I could think of. Standing, crouching, looking down the street the way she came at it, looking from the angle of her driveway. I walked across it twice in slightly different paths. You couldn't see anything. You couldn't feel anything unusual underfoot. It looked like a lawn corner that needed reseeding and nothing more. I stood there in the late afternoon light with dirt on my hands, and I thought about Earl. Cut them flush. Aim for the oil pan. Don't rush the spacing. She drove over them for the first time the next morning. I was in the kitchen making coffee, and I heard her garage door. I watched her pull out and take her usual arc across the corner at her usual speed. I heard nothing. She heard nothing. She drove down the street. I exhaled, set the coffee down, and stood there for a second. I want to explain why nothing happened, because this is the part of the story that confuses people the most. When she drove through on a straight arc at 15 miles an hour, her tires rolled forward. The tread, the thick hardened part on the outside, was the surface making contact with the ground. A flush steel post under a forward-rolling tire at moderate speed is a firm bump. The tread compresses slightly over it and keeps rolling. Think of it like driving over a large coin lying flat in the road. You feel it for a half second and it's gone. Because the posts were flush, because there was no height for the undercarriage to catch, the clearance between her oil pan and the ground was never threatened. Not on a straight pass, not at that speed. The car had no idea anything was there. She had no idea anything was there. That was the point. She drove over them again that evening. Same arc, same speed, nothing. 4 times the next day. I know because I started counting. 4 times in one day. And every single time I heard her garage door open, my stomach dropped through the floor. Every single time she completed the arc and nothing happened, I stood at the window, breathed slowly, and went back to whatever I was doing. 4 times a day for 3 days. Every single time, nothing. She had no idea. The 3rd day was hard. I want to be honest about that. By the 3rd day of nothing happening, I started to wonder if I'd miscalculated something. The depth, the gauge of the steel, the vehicle clearance. I went outside that evening and walked the corner in the dark, felt around with my fingers. The posts were there, solid, exactly where I'd put them, exactly flush. I went back inside and told myself 3 days is nothing. But wait, it gets worse. Because while I was waiting, she posted again. The Facebook post went up on a Wednesday evening. She wrote that some people had been trying to stop her words, with various obstacles over the past few weeks, that none of it had worked, and that she wanted everyone to know that she would be doing a special birthday burnout this Friday night at 9 o'clock. A birthday burnout. She was calling it a party. She said everyone was welcome to watch. She said she was going to do 3 full 360s this time. She said she was going to post the video afterward, and she hoped it would get more than 17 likes this time. She used a birthday cake emoji at the end of the post. A birthday cake emoji. I sat with my phone in my hand and I read that post twice. She was scheduling a public event on my lawn. She was inviting the neighborhood to watch. She was using my corner lot as a venue for her birthday party. I put my phone down, went to the kitchen, got a glass of water, and stood at the window, looking at the corner. I thought about what Earl had said and what I now understood about how this was going to work, and then I thought about something I had not fully considered until that moment. A 360 spin out is not a straight pass. When she floored that SUV into a full rotation, her tires would not be rolling forward. They would be spinning laterally, sideways at extremely high RPM. And here's the critical difference. The part of the tire that contacts the ground on a lateral spin is not the tread. It is the sidewall. The sidewall is the thin, flexible part of the tire that was never designed to be a contact surface. It is not hardened. It is not built for impact. A flush steel post edge meeting a sidewall spinning at full throttle does not compress and roll over it the way the tread does on a straight pass. It catches it. It shreds it. The tire doesn't absorb it. The tire fails. And there was a second thing. Under hard acceleration and full lateral load, the suspension of a large SUV compresses downward. The vehicle body drops. The ground clearance that had been protecting her undercarriage on every moderate speed straight pass disappears under the force of a full-speed spin-out. The car gets closer to the ground at the exact same moment the tires are failing. So when the tires go, the vehicle doesn't just roll to a stop on flat rubber, it drops. Hard and fast, directly onto the rims, directly onto whatever is sitting at ground level waiting for it. And that is when the undercarriage meets the posts, not from the posts reaching up, from the car falling down. I stood at that window for a long time, working through this. The problem was simple. I had spaced everything for a straight pass at 15 miles an hour. I hadn't designed it for a full speed rotation. I didn't know if the spacing I'd used would hold up under that kind of force, or if it would produce something far less controlled. I'll be honest, I thought about going back out there and pulling the posts, not because I felt bad for her. I didn't. I thought about it because I had calculated for one scenario, and she had just announced a completely different scenario on the neighborhood Facebook page. I wasn't sure my numbers applied. I went back to my diagram. I checked the spacing again. I sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours running the same calculation in different ways. Eventually, I concluded this. The spacing I'd used was actually less dangerous for the high-speed rotation scenario than I'd feared. The posts were positioned to make contact with the tires progressively as the vehicle rotated, rather than all at once. Progressive contact decelerates. Simultaneous contact flips a vehicle. I hadn't accidentally built the version that flips a vehicle. I'd built the version that stops one. Mostly, I was right. The cop would tell me later I was almost right. Almost. It's a word I've thought about a lot since then. I didn't pull the posts. Thursday passed. She drove over them 4 more times. Nothing happened. She had less than 24 hours until her birthday event, and she had no idea that the corner she'd been treating as her personal entertainment venue for 6 weeks wasn't the same corner she'd started with. Thursday night, I went to bed and slept better than I had in 6 weeks. I got up Friday morning, made breakfast, went to work, came home, ate dinner, watched some TV. At 9:15, I turned off the TV, sat in the dark living room, and waited. 9 o'clock came and went. 9:30, still dark, the street quiet, a couple of porch lights across the street, maybe people waiting outside, maybe gone back in when she didn't show. 10 o'clock, nothing. I sat another 20 minutes, then went to bed, thinking maybe she'd changed her mind. Maybe the posts were just posturing. Maybe the birthday party had been relocated. Maybe she'd started drinking at 7 and it wasn't happening tonight. I fell asleep around 11. The next morning, I made toast. I checked the time, 11:17. Saturday. I was standing at the kitchen counter, waiting for the toast. Refrigerator open, looking for butter, when I heard something outside I've never heard before and can't describe accurately no matter how hard I try. The closest I can get, someone dropping a piano from a rooftop onto concrete. One enormous impact followed by a metallic tearing noise that lasted about 2 full seconds, and then the sound of a vehicle that had been moving very fast and suddenly stopped. Then silence, then screaming. I dropped the butter, walked to the front window, stopped in the doorway. All 4 tires had blown simultaneously. Not a gradual blowout, not a slow leak. The sidewalls had shredded under the lateral spin exactly as I'd calculated, and the vehicle had dropped hard onto its rims in the middle of my front lawn, the full weight of a large SUV behind it. The front end was down about 14 inches from where it should have been. When it hit, the undercarriage came down too. And the posts that couldn't reach the oil pan from ground level were suddenly right there, perfectly aligned with an undercarriage sitting on bare rims after a 14-inch drop. The front skid plate was bent backward at an angle that should have been physically impossible given the original geometry of that vehicle. Fluid spread across the grass in a dark pool. Oil, transmission fluid, both. She was sitting in the driver's seat, not moving, just screaming. Not words, not for help. The raw, continuous, unfiltered sound that comes from someone who cannot yet process what has happened. She screamed for 12 minutes. 12 minutes. I know because I stood at my window the entire time, phone in hand, watching the clock. 11:17 on a Saturday morning, a destroyed $82,000 Mercedes on my front lawn. 12 minutes of screaming. Here's what happened during those 12 minutes. Front doors opened across the street. Then another. Then 3 more. People came out of houses up and down Elmwood Drive, moving with the careful, measured energy of people who'd been waiting for a noise like that for 6 weeks without admitting it to themselves. Nobody ran. Nobody panicked. They came outside, stood on porches and walkways, and looked at the Mercedes, at Karen, at each other. A man 2 doors down went back inside, then came out with a folding chair and set it on his front walk. A woman from the corner did the same. A guy from the end of the street, whose name I later learned was Phil, and who I now consider a genuine friend, came outside with a bag of microwave popcorn. Nobody walked over to help her. Nobody called out to her. Nobody said a word. They just stood or sat and watched. Like they'd all received the same silent memo, watch quietly. Eventually, she stopped screaming, sat in the car for a few more minutes, staring forward. Then she got out, looked at her car, looked at the lawn, looked at the people in their folding chairs, at Phil with his popcorn, and then she looked at me. I had been standing in my doorway the entire time, unmoving, expression unchanged. She started screaming at me specifically. Most of it was incoherent. Cataloging it would take longer than it's worth. The point is, she was still screaming when the police arrived. Still full voice when 2 officers stepped out of their car. One officer went to the Mercedes, crouched to inspect the underside, walked around it, crouched again on the lawn side, feeling the grass the way someone does when they already know what they're looking for. He found a post, stood up, called the other officer over. They spoke in low voices for about 15 minutes while Karen continued her volume-driven monologue behind them. I watched from my doorway. Phil ate his popcorn. One officer walked over to Karen and said something. She stopped mid-sentence. He said it again. She looked at the lawn, then at her car, and started screaming again, but less focused this time, more general. She had just been told something she hadn't expected. Then the other officer walked over to me. He stepped onto my porch and stood close enough that what he said was only for me. I want to be specific about his tone because it matters. He didn't sound like a man delivering a reprimand. He sounded like a man delivering a technical correction. He leaned in slightly, looked at me, and said, "Next time, space them a little further apart. You almost flipped her." Then he stepped back, nodded once, and returned to his partner. I stayed on my porch, thinking about Earl telling me not to rush the spacing, thinking about my Wednesday night calculations, thinking about almost. I had been off by some, not a lot, but some. The progressive contact had worked as planned. The drop had worked as planned. The almost was in the rotational momentum carrying the vehicle further across the post than I'd measured, creating more lateral force on the chassis than I'd accounted for. A few inches more separation, and that force would have been absorbed rather than accumulated. I filed that away. I wasn't going to need it again, but I filed it anyway. The tow truck took 2 hours to arrive. I stayed outside for all of it, doing minor lawn work near the corner, staying present without being the guy who just stands and watches. The driver spent a long time figuring out how to get purchase on a vehicle with no functional undercarriage. When he finally had it loaded, he told Karen the charge was $1,100. She asked if he could do better. He looked at her, then at his truck, then at the people still in their folding chairs. "No. Just no," he said, with the quiet finality of a man who decided the answer before he even got there. And that is exactly how it ended. But now I want to hear from you. Did I go too far, or did Karen get exactly what she deserved? Drop it in the comments below, because I read every single one, and honestly, your reactions are half the reason I keep making these. If you've got your own story, share it down there too, because some of you have sent me things that make my situations look completely mild. Hit the like button if you made it this far. It helps this channel more than most people realize. And subscribe if you haven't already, because the next story is already coming, and I promise you it is worse than this one. Now, one last thing. I put everything into these stories for free, and I plan to keep doing that. But if these videos mean something to you, if they make you laugh or frustrated or just feel like you're not alone in dealing with people like this, consider joining the membership. It costs less than a coffee, it keeps this channel going, and members get content that never makes it to the main channel. The link is right below this video. I would genuinely love to have you in there. All right, that's it from me. I'll see you in the next one.